Chapter 16. The Quest for Justice. My husband is cheating again. Sade stared at the severely distressed woman who sat on the other side of her desk. Once again she was faced with a client who required her services for resolving a domestic upheaval. Another routine job for which she would be expected to uncover the truth by taking a peek behind the proverbial curtain. On this occasion, judging from the vacant expression on Sade's face, it was evident she was preoccupied with thoughts of a more critical nature. The hit-and-run incident was her first serious investigation of note. She had now identified the man suspected of being culpable for taking the lives of her client's parents, but there were still no guarantees that justice of any kind would prevail. On a positive note, however, that morning the private investigator had received a mobile text message from her client, which had left her both pleased and excited. The text had read, "Hi Sade, thanks a million for your help. I hope this isn't too early in the day, but thought you deserved an update. In the next 5 minutes, I'll be shooting off to Abuja with the police officer who first notified me of my parents' passing 2 weeks ago. He's given me his word that the man responsible for this crime will be arrested and has invited me along to watch him get the job done. I know it sounds a little nutty, but the offer was a little too good to refuse, and although the prospect of coming face to face with this man is nerve-wracking, I'm confident that the experience of witnessing him being placed in handcuffs will be well worth the effort. Anyhow, thanks for all your help, and at the risk of sounding a bit too forward, would love to take you out for dinner when it's all over and done with. See you later. Michael." Coming to the end of the message, Sade had smiled. She was pleased the man from London had set the ball rolling. She also thought it prudent that Michael had found a police officer who was already familiar with the case to take the lead in having Juku arrested. However, she had never met a police officer who was immune to corruption, and suspected Michael would be expected to fork out a hefty fee for such a premium service. Seeking justice, the end, in her view, more than justified the means. She smiled at Michael's offer to take her out to dinner. It had been 2 years since she was romantically involved with anyone. Even then, the affair had been brief. 3 months, to be exact. The man was the 35-year-old son of an oil tycoon who lived in the city of Port Harcourt and made several trips to Lagos by private jet each week. The gifts were lavish and had included expensive jewelry that she had shown little interest in wearing, and envelopes loaded with hard cash which she had frequently turned down. Difficulties in the relationship had quickly emerged after she discovered the tycoon's son complete disregard for the less fortunate, those whom he had frequently referred to as pathetic church rats. There were also reports of a dramatic increase in the theft of crude oil, which had triggered suspicions of the legitimacy of his father's wealth and ultimately brought the relationship to a swift but amicable end. Michael, however, was different. Granted, she had only known him for 5 minutes, but she could tell he was a man who couldn't be bought, a man who had a strong sense of right and wrong. He also appeared smart and resourceful and didn't seem afraid to appear vulnerable, a rare but admirable quality in a man. She thought about the non-disclosure agreement she had made him sign and wondered if she had come across as being somewhat cold and distrusting. It wasn't the first time she had felt this way, but following a violent attack she had experienced the previous year, it was one of two precautions she had employed for her own safety. The incident had coincided with an unannounced visit to her office by the husband of one of her female clients, a man Sade had proved to be responsible for fathering 4 illegitimate children over the course of a 5-year marriage. She remembered how the man had sat across from her, ostensibly calm and collected, a quiet smile on his face. Before she could inquire about the purpose of his visit, the smile had vanished and he was upon her, leaping across the desk with a ferocity she could never have anticipated. Snatching a handful of Sade's hair, he had smashed his fist into her face. She had screamed, and he had responded with another vicious strike, this time a backhanded slap across her cheek. Unable to loosen the man's fist from the grip on her hair, Sade's self-preservatory instincts had instantly kicked in. Grabbing a pair of scissors from the desk, she drove its pointed edge through the man's exposed palm as he attempted to hit her with an open hand. Releasing her hair like a scorched potato, the man had howled with the intensity of a wounded animal. He had backed away, bleeding like an open faucet across her office rug, and Sade had made her escape. It was a crucial lesson which she had addressed with stringent protective measures. The first measure was to only establish contact with the public online and make individual appointments at her own discretion. The second involved the introduction of the mandatory non-disclosure agreement, which she figured would serve as a deterrent to anyone who might consider sharing her identity. And the third, but most essential means of protecting herself from a physical standpoint, was the legal acquisition of a handgun on the advice of a family acquaintance. The gun was a Glock 22, small but lethal in capacity, a final solution that she was keen to avoid, but in a crisis one she would rather have than not. Her mind flashed back to the text message from Michael and the phone call she had received shortly afterwards. The caller was her paid informant, Titi, who now had concerns about the friend she claimed had left the club with Juku on the morning of the incident. "I am worried about my friend, though," Titi had said. "She is not answering her phone, and her mother called last night to say she has not seen her since last week." "You sure she was with Juku that night?" "Of course. I go lie to you." "Then you've got nothing to worry about," Sade had said. "My client is working towards having him arrested in the next few hours." "Ah, that one go hard though," Titi had replied in disbelief. "Then fit arrest the big man picking." "When the big man is behind bars, I can't see why not." "Okay, I trust you. Call me when you hear something, I beg. Now only my friend Mata will concern me." As Sade recalled the conversation, she glanced up at a mounted wall clock. It had just gone 3 p.m., several hours since Michael's text message. It took a minimum of 9 hours to reach Abuja. She didn't expect to hear anything from him until at least 6 in the evening. Then the sound of a client's voice finally brought her back to earth. "Hello?" Sade's eyes became alert. "Right, where were we?" "I don't know," the woman said. "It looked like you were sleeping with your eyes open, like a witch." Sade smiled. "I'm sorry, long day. Now, back to your husband." Chapter 17. Jonah. Mr. Taffy. It was the following morning, and the discomfort from the sudden rise in temperature once again stirred me awake. On this occasion, however, the inconvenience had been anticipated. Stripped to the waist, I swung my legs over the edge of the bed. I pushed both fists into the mattress. It was nice and firm, leaving me satisfied that, unlike the inconsistent power supply from NEPA, my request that the hotel provide a separate room with a mattress capable of supporting the weight of a man of 250 pounds plus company had been met without issue. I gazed at Fumi. She was asleep and appeared dead to the world. The night had been particularly satisfying, yet there was a certain intimacy in the manner Fumi performed her services which convinced me that she wasn't naturally suited to this line of work. Ready for a cold shower, I rose to my feet and heard her voice. "You didn't like my room." I spun around. Fumi was awake, her eyes fresh and alert, like she'd been up all night long. She sat upright and crossed her legs in a tailor-like fashion. "Not a great deal of space," I said. Had me feeling sort of boxed in. "Sorry, it's all I can afford." "Ever thought of doing something else?" "You mean like going to school?" "Might be a start." "I have a family to take care of." "You're married?" She looked at me, a baffled expression on her face. "Why would I be doing this work if I was married?" "I've seen worse." "God forbid," she said, whipping her hand around the top of her head and clicking her fingers in a throwaway gesture, which I would later discover meant such a thing was nothing short of an abomination. "When I say family, I mean my parents and junior ones." "Siblings?" "3 brothers and 1 sister," she replied. "I am the firstborn." "Steep price to pay." "I don't have a choice," she mumbled. "There's no money in the country. Even my rent hasn't been paid." I looked at her, convinced of 2 specific things. First, everyone has a choice. Second, whatever an individual elects to do or not do is strictly down to them. However, the benign features of Fumi's face and the sadness in her eyes told me that, like most people on the face of the planet, she was simply afraid and uncertain. "How much?" I asked. With her eyes regaining their sparkle, Fumi stretched back out across the bed and faced me in a prone position. She had both feet dangling up in the air behind her, one leg crossed over the other. Cupping her chin in the palms of her hands, the points of her elbows digging into the mattress, she said, 10,000 naira, and that's only because I like you." I meant the rent. Fumi stared at me in disbelief. 30,000 naira, she whispered. "I haven't paid my landlord for 2 months." I reached for my wallet on the bedside table and folded it open. Fishing out 350s from a bunch of notes that was steadily depleting, I handed the cash to her. "For the roof over your head and our time last night," I said. Returning to the cross-legged position and trembling visibly with emotion, she accepted the money with both hands. "This is almost 50,000 naira, she said, a tear of gratitude running down her cheek. "I'll call you a cab," I said. Half an hour later, I accompanied Fumi through the lobby to grab a taxi. As we walked along, I noticed a man in his late 60s standing at the reception desk. He looked borderline anorexic, but was communicating with a uniformed member of staff in an animated fashion. A collection of male heads, the old man's included, turned to admire Fumi's stunning physique. 10 minutes later, she was on her merry way. I headed back through the lobby, and the staff member behind the reception desk aimed a finger at me. The old man plodded in my direction, his arms outstretched, like a man on the verge of confronting a long-lost relative. "Jonah!" he bellowed. I stopped in my tracks. "Do I know you?" I said. He also stopped. Probably 3 feet away, a look on his face that appeared to suggest he considered my question to be something of an insult. "I don't blame you," he said contemptuously, pointing an accusatory finger at me like a man chastising his son. "I don't blame you," phrased in a manner I would later learn simply meant that he thought I ought to know better. I scrutinized the man for a moment and concluded that this was merely a case of mistaken identity. "Nice meeting you," I said, and kept moving. The man said nothing. He waited as I walked past him, then shouted, "It is your Uncle Taffy!" I stopped again, pivoted back around, and faced the man I'd always referred to as Mr. Taffy. 10 minutes later, we were seated at a table in the bar. Mr. Taffy was enjoying a giant plate of jollof rice that I had ordered from the kitchen. Jollof rice, several pieces of fried plantain, and a fat piece of fried chicken. Scooping up large mouthfuls of rice with a spoon rather than a fork, he also had a bottle of chilled water made possible by the ever-reliable Tunde. The bartender was making good on the tip I'd given him and had the fridge loaded with cold drinks on standby. I sat across from Mr. Taffy, knocking back a large Guinness. He stared at me. In an accusatory tone, he said, "You're drinking stout for breakfast?" My version of coffee. It's not a good habit. Does the job. He looked at me and shoveled another spoonful of rice into his mouth. "Why have you not bothered to call me since you arrived?" "Got caught up in a little situation," I said. "Of course," he said sarcastically. "Like the one that just followed you out of the hotel, Abby?" He gestured with his spoon in the direction he had watched me accompany Fumi. "Needed to let off a bit of steam," I said. "What work have you done to be letting off any steam?" Had to take care of a couple of hoodlums on the way in. A look of panic registered on Mr. Taffy's face. "What do you mean by hoodlums?" "Robbers," I said. "Armed ones." "Armed robbers?" He dropped his fork in his plate with a loud clatter. I quietly took another swig from my bottle. Not after I was done. "Jesus, Jonah, do you want to die here?" "Not if I can help it." "This is Lagos." "So they tell me." He shook his head in resignation and continued eating. "This is not why I asked you to come." I said nothing in return. He looked at me inquisitively. "Anyway, have you spoken to your brother?" "Briefly." "And?" "Seems pretty confident about what he's doing." "And you think that's okay?" "If he can deal with the outcome." "I don't get you." "Potential disappointment," I said. "This your grammar is too much," he replied irritably. He took a long, satisfying swig from his bottle of water. "Where is he now?" I glanced over at Tunde, who was standing behind the counter, cleaning out a wine glass. "Seen my brother today?" I asked. "He left this morning." Uncle Taffy's head snapped around. "Left? Left to where?" "He did not tell me, sir." The look on Tunde's face indicated he was worried he had disclosed a piece of information that may have been better left unspoken. "One policeman came to pick him up." "What time?" I asked. "Just after 6. I gave him a quick reassuring smile. "Thanks, Tunde." "Anytime, sir." I turned to Mr. Taffy. He had now finished his meal and was wiping the corners of his mouth with a napkin. "They will finish your brother's money in this place," he said. "I'd like to think he's smarter than that," I replied. "Let's hope so." He drained the rest of his bottle. "How long are you staying?" "Haven't decided yet." He nodded and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "It is good you have come, but now you are here, it is only proper that we visit your parents' burial ground." I looked at him and realized the hand he had placed on my shoulder was intended as a comforting gesture. A human touch during a time most people would consider to be incredibly sensitive. But I wasn't most people. Naturally, I had my concerns about the seriousness of the current situation, but unlike your average Joe, I'd always been built of tougher stuff. You were right, I replied. Wouldn't hurt. Chapter 18. Michael. Road trip. Inspector Balogun and I set off for Abuja the next morning. We headed north, driving through several small towns, across a number of extended motorways and stretches of road cocooned by thick forests. Shortly before the police officer's prompt arrival, I had fired off a text message to Shade. After mentioning my destination, I had offered to take her out to dinner upon my return. I also thought about bringing Joan up to speed about the latest development, but given he had found himself another room and some overnight company, I thought I'd let it wait. The journey was long, far longer than I'd expected, but it wasn't until a low battery signal flashed up on my mobile handset that Balogun revealed to me that our destination, which I thought was another part of Lagos, happened to be an entirely different city. Just see it as a free road trip, he had said unapologetically. At least this way you can say you did some sightseeing when you were in the country. I delivered a silent nod. Feeling physically sore and severely cramped, I was in no mood to play the happy tourist. Fancy turning on the air conditioner, I said, a stream of sweat pouring off my brow. There is no gas, he said, but the breeze from outside is good. I nodded again, accepting the fact that I just had to grit my teeth and bear it. So, how well do you know Juku? I asked, switching subjects. His father was the governor of River State, Balogun replied. River State? The only part of the country that produces oil. He looked at me and said, It's where I'm from, and a place Juku and his father helped destroy. How so? Needs to be seen to be believed. Hunger, unemployment, crime. I'm sorry to hear that. Sorry? A puzzled expression registered on his face. There is only one man who needs to be sorry, and for your sake and mine, I will make sure he is. I gazed at him for a moment and realized that despite my passion for justice, it also mattered that I had proof Juku was guilty. Do you think you'll be able to get all the evidence we need? Evidence, he said, with another bewildered look on his face. You think this man might be innocent? Just want to be sure we do the right thing, that's all. The man is guilty, he said abruptly. He paused for a spell. He has always been guilty. I said nothing in return, not wanting to rock the boat, but equally concerned about the possibility of being complicit in some form of injustice. A short while later, I noticed changes in the motorway, smoother surfaces, more clearly defined lanes, dual carriageways, and prominent road signs, all of which gave the familiar feeling of taking a trip down London's M25. A billboard-sized signboard, "Welcome to Abuja," appeared by the side of the road. Sure we're in the same country, I said, attempting to inject a dose of humour into what had been a seriously intense conversation. It's the Chinese, Balogun said. They are heavily involved in the reconstruction of our roads these days. It must be a good thing. If you're a government contractor. I meant it must be good for the people. What is good for the people of this country has never been of any concern to the government, he said. And thanks to bastards like Juku, never will be. Looking at him again, I was horrified at the hypocrisy of a man who, despite being the absolute personification of police corruption, still felt entitled to point the finger. 30 minutes later, we were weaving through the city. After making several turns, like a trip through a maze, we drove into what appeared to be an affluent neighborhood. There were several huge gated residences, only the road was riddled with potholes, clearly an area the Chinese had chosen to ignore. "Are we close?" I asked. "5 minutes," Balogun whispered. We drove through the neighborhood, the homes eventually disappearing. We were on a small stretch of road where there was nothing in sight, nothing but dense woodland either side. Less than a minute later, a large bungalow appeared on the passenger side of the street. The home stood behind a set of Victorian-style driveway gates that served as the entrance to a spacious, pristine-looking compound. Balogun slowed to a crawl and pulled over. Parked directly across from the bungalow, Balogun turned to look at a giant number sign fixed to the gates. He fished out from his breast pocket the address I had handed him earlier and confirmed the house number was identical with the number on the gates. "This is the place." I looked at the home of the man who was the likely killer of both my parents and spotted a shabbily dressed, elderly-looking security guard on the other side of the gates. Sitting on a stool, he was eating a loaf of bread and sipping a bowl of soup with a spoon. A sickening feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. I could hear my heart slamming against my chest. Balogun withdrew his gun, cocked it for action, and looked at me. "You look nervous," he said. "Just a little bit," I replied. He placed a weighty hand on my shoulder and with no words of comfort or reassurance, simply said, "Let's go." Together we climbed out of the car and hiked over to the front gates. Balogun marching ahead of me, pistol at the ready. The gateman spotted us as we approached. He abandoned his meal and scurried over. "Good afternoon," he said. "Where is your Aga?" Balogun demanded. "Please, what is it concerning, sir?" Balogun leveled the gun at his head. "Open the gate, my friend," he yelled. The gateman nodded obediently, dashed across to one end of the gates, and yanked open a side entrance, a separate metal door for foot traffic. He led us over to the front porch, where 3 ominous-looking men, seated in a circle, were playing a game of Ludo. Dressed in black, the men resembled a gang of street thugs for hire. The first guy was obese, while the second looked like a part-time bodybuilder. The third guy, who couldn't have stood an inch over 5'2", had a pair of dead eyes, which could have belonged to a shark. Having spotted Balogun's gun, the men neither said nor did anything. Following the gateman, we walked up to the front door, which was fashioned of marble. Visibly apprehensive, the gateman reached out and opened the door, but only did this wide enough to stick his head through. He spoke to someone inside. "Oga, sorry to disturb you, but one policeman..." Before he could finish, Balogun seized him by the scruff of the neck, threw him to one side, and pushed the door open the rest of the way. As my heart raced a million beats per minute, I followed Balogun into a spacious lounge. A man in his early 30s was seated on a wide leather couch. He had the delicate build of a 12-year-old boy and sat behind a glass coffee table. The table looked expensive and had a stuffed envelope sitting on it. Directly across from him, where the man sat, a wall-mounted 70-inch flat-screen television was silently running a CNN report. Aside from this, there was nothing to reveal the personality of the individual who lived there. No photographs, no wall art, no personal effects. Balogun leveled the pistol at the man. "Simon Juku!" The man turned and stared at Balogun, a blank expression on his face. Then Balogun did something which caused me to breathe a sigh of relief. Lowering his gun, he walked over to Juku, a move which gave me the reassurance that justice could prevail without the threat of violence. As Balogun stepped before the man that no one had thought I would ever find, Juku looked up at him and uttered 2 words that sent a chill down my spine. "You're late." The words caught me like a trapped bone in the throat. My eyes went to Balogun, expecting a reaction, any reaction, to convince me that what I thought I'd just heard was a mistake. He neither said nor did anything, just stood there, poker-faced. Juku reached over to the coffee table, picked up the envelope, and handed it to the man who had given himself the undeserved moniker of a fictional Vietnam War veteran. The envelope was open, and a stash of banknotes was plain to see. Balogun accepted the envelope with a cold smile. I stared at him, dumbfounded. The words "you're late" continued to echo through my head like a cracked record disc. Realizing I'd been set up, time stood still for a second, but no longer. With a surge of adrenaline flashing through my veins, I realized my only chance of survival was to run. Run for dear life, whipping around in a desperate attempt to escape. A giant fist flew in my direction. The punch landed with an explosive thud, and the room around me disappeared. Chapter 19. Jonah. 12 hours. 48 hours after visiting the graveside of Mr. and Mrs. Echo, I made a mid-morning return to Comfort Hotel and trudged back through the lobby. The trip out of town, where they'd both been laid to rest, was a grueling one and left me physically spent. However, after paying my respects, it was a journey I was glad to have made. I approached the reception desk and spotted Tunde exiting the bar. His face lit up as he saw me. "Oga, you travel?" he asked, hurrying over to meet me. It was one of those phrases I figured technically meant one thing but contextually meant another, the word travel specifically being used to inquire if I had left the city. I nodded. "Ah, sorry sir, you look tired." "Any sign of my brother?" "Oga, he has not returned though." I paused for a moment. I was a little surprised, but also a touch uneasy. Producing my mobile phone, I selected Michael's number, thumbed dial, and flattened the handset to my ear. The call was diverted to a generic voicemail service. I punched out and turned to Tunde. "This police officer you saw him leave with the other morning, do you remember what he looked like?" "He's shot," Tunde said, placing the flat of his hand across his chest as an indication of the man's height. "But get big body." He expanded his arms to demonstrate the man's size. "Anything else?" "He yellow." "Yellow?" "Yes, like person that bleaches skin." I was silent for a moment, silent as I considered the absurd coincidence that the man Tunde had described could be the same officer I had seen earlier, a police officer nicknamed Rambo. "Did you see his car?" I asked. "Yes, he come with a pickup truck." "A Hilux?" "Yes, Japanese Hilux," he said with a look of surprise. "You know the person?" I said nothing in return. After seeing Rambo in action, I knew enough to have me concerned that Michael was in the company of a man who possessed a personality that was both dangerous and unpredictable. "I need access to my brother's room," I said. 5 minutes later, I was provided with entry to Michael's room by the duty manager. Closing the door, I scanned the surroundings, searching for some clue to rule out the possibility of foul play in Michael's 2-day absence. But the more I looked, the more I was convinced of just the opposite. His luggage was still parked in the corner of the room. Glancing over at the bathroom, I spotted his towel hanging on the door and his toothbrush stuck in a cup by the sink. Michael had no plans of spending one, let alone 2 nights out on the trot. A disturbing possibility then occurred to me. The possibility that my brother was being holed up somewhere against his will. I sat on the edge of the bed. If the officer who had picked Michael up that morning was the same man I'd seen in the bar, did he have anything to do with Michael's disappearance? And if he did, why? Then I remembered a statistic I'd once heard on a popular British television show, Crime Watch. A statistic which claimed that 72 hours was all you had to find a victim of a kidnapping alive. 72 hours, the equivalent of 3 days. Michael had been gone for 2, meaning provided this was a kidnapping, he had 24 hours left. 24 hours in theory, but considering the limitations of performing a search overnight, probably half that time. 12 hours. My gaze fell upon a piece of paper lying on the floor. I picked it up. There was both a name and an address scribbled across the paper in Michael's handwriting. It read Shade Nonso, Moonlight Investigations, Lagos, 14 Allen Avenue. Chapter 20. The Evil That Men Do. On the morning Simon Juku stole the lives of Mr. and Mrs. Echo, his father's time in office was already a distant memory, and the privileges Juku had once enjoyed a thing of the past. Then along came Rambo. Juku still remembered their initial encounter, the ominous sighting of a motor vehicle from a quarter-mile off, a police truck with no sound of an approaching siren, only the furious glow of flashing blue lights as the car raced towards them. Then a surge of panic as he had attempted to flee the scene, a desperate move in which he had battled to start a motor vehicle which had stalled on 3 separate attempts. The evil that men do lives after them, Juku had often heard, a quote which had made him wonder if this was a case of the proverbial chickens coming home to roost. The ultimate comeuppance for both the sins of himself and his father. Juku could still remember Rambo's weapon, a lethal 9mm. Spotting the firearm, he had given Emenike a look that ordered him to remain calm, not because Juku had any particular affection for the 6'9" colossus, but with the man in the white hat arriving in the next few days to pay £50,000 in cash for the giant's services, Emenike was one lucrative asset Juku could not afford to have damaged. The tension had been incredible. Juku could not forget when the officer had stepped before him. At that moment he had spotted the facial expression he had seen 1,000,000 times before, the look of a man with a moral conscience parked on 0. It could amount to only one thing. For the right price, there would be no arrest and no trial. Only a silent compromise. Moments later, and just as Juku had anticipated, a figure had been agreed upon and a bribe of 100,000 naira, equating to £500, had changed hands. 100,000 naira in cash, which the officer had happily accepted in exchange for his silence, leaving Juku with only a couple of remaining concerns, neither of which had anything to do with the mangled bodies sprawled across the battered road. The first concern was the young girl in the back seat, an eyewitness who was unlikely to remain quiet about the incident. Then there was the second issue, not as complex, but a problem nonetheless. How was Juku to get a return flight to his residence in the city of Abuja? It wasn't long before he would find answers to both. For the first matter, he had offered the girl an extra fee to accompany him to his final destination, where she would be conveniently disposed of by Emenike. For the second issue, he had made a similar cash offer to the police officer and convinced him to ferry them to the nearest airport. Just before their departure, Juku had seen Rambo answer a damaged phone. The handset belonged to the dead woman and seemed to have spiked Rambo's interest. Juku had concluded from this observation that Rambo was a dangerous opportunist. A dangerous opportunist with the potential to be a future asset. A few days later, Juku had received an unexpected call from the officer warning him that trouble was headed his way. The son of the deceased couple had arrived in the country. After somehow discovering Juku's identity, he was seeking police assistance to have him tracked down. The two men had negotiated a price, another substantial figure which Juku was willing to pay to Rambo to have this man brought to him, the man known as Michael. Now, less than 24 hours later, the police officer had delivered. Juku turned to Rambo, whose services he was to need again soon. "Once he gives us the name of his informant, I will give you a call," Juku said. Emenike scooped up Michael's unconscious body like a rag doll and slung it over his shoulder. "How long?" Rambo grunted, pocketing the stuffed envelope. "A few hours, probably less." "Call me when you have a name and location," Rambo said coldly. Juku watched as the policeman disappeared out of the front door. The man in the white hat would be arriving tomorrow, at which time this shitstorm had to be over and done with. He thought about what Rambo had told him over the phone about the man Emenike had placed in what he hoped was a temporary coma. "He wouldn't mention how he got to know who you were," Rambo had said, "so he's going to need some persuading." Juku smiled to himself. Ah, the sweet art of persuasion. One of Emenike's unique talents, which Juku had personally witnessed him administer to several of his father's adversaries. Sadistic acts of torture which were carried out like a creative work of art. He poured himself a shot of whiskey and downed it in one gulp. Wouldn't be long now.